Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the 1950s when a group of people sat down in quiet rooms, took something science had barely named, and tried to describe what was happening to them. Not what it did on paper, not what it was supposed to do, what it actually felt like. Because in that decade, the same substance moved through very different places. A hospital trying to heal people, a government trying to control them, and a handful of rooms where no one was entirely sure what they were looking at. Same molecule, completely different experiences, and the strange part is, none of them were wrong, just incomplete. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to know who else is awake while we find out what it actually felt like to be inside one of history's most misunderstood experiments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By the early 1950s, LSD had arrived in psychiatric clinics across Europe. Sandoz, the Swiss pharmaceutical company that made it, was distributing it freely to any credentialed researcher who asked. The idea was straightforward. This substance does something to the mind. Psychiatrists should understand what that something is. Some took it themselves. Others gave it to patients who had run out of other options. What happened in those sessions, the ones conducted properly, with preparation, with a guide present, with the patient's knowledge and consent, was not what the headlines would later suggest. Picture this. It's 1954, and you're sitting in a hospital in Worcestershire, England. You've been in therapy for 4 years, not the kind that fixed anything, the kind where you sit in a chair and someone asks you how that makes you feel, and you say you don't know, and they write something in a notebook and you go home feeling slightly worse than when you arrived, and you come back the following Tuesday and you do it again. For 4 years. You have things inside you that you haven't been able to reach. You know they're there. They have a particular weight to them, a specific pressure that sits somewhere behind your ribs when you're tired. But when you try to look at them directly, they move. This is what has been happening for 4 years. The thing you came to fix keeps moving. This morning a psychiatrist named Ronald Sanderson hands you a small glass of water. He tells you what's in it. He tells you it's experimental. He tells you he'll be in the room the whole time, in a chair in the corner, and you can speak if you need to, and you don't have to speak if you don't. He asks if you have questions. You don't have questions. You've been in therapy for 4 years. At this point, you drink something handed to you by a psychiatrist in a quiet room in Worcestershire, even if he told you it was mildly experimental, and also possibly quite strange. You drink the water. For the first 40 minutes, nothing. You lie on the couch. The room is the same room it was before. The curtains are slightly too heavy for the windows. The clock on the wall makes a sound you've never noticed before. A small, deliberate sound, like it's thinking about each second before it commits. You close your eyes, open them again. The ceiling is still a ceiling. Then the ceiling starts to breathe. Not dramatically. Not in the way a film would show it. Not warping, not melting, not turning into a face. Just gently expanding and contracting, as if the room itself had decided to be alive. You watch this for what feels like a long time. You're not frightened. This surprises you. You thought you would be frightened. Your hands, when you look at them, are very interesting. You've had hands your entire life and paid almost no attention to them. Now you look at them for what the clock would suggest is approximately 11 minutes, examining them as if they were a piece of correspondence that arrived in an unexpected language. The lines across your palm, the small architecture of the knuckles. There is a kind of precision to the construction that strikes you as remarkable, and you think that maybe things have always been this precise, and you simply haven't been paying the right kind of attention. The music Sanderson put on, something quiet, something without words, is moving through you differently than music usually moves, not in your ears, through you. as if the sound is a thing that exists in 3 dimensions and your body is inside it. You close your eyes. This is where the session gets harder to describe. Not because it becomes chaotic, because it doesn't. It becomes, if anything, quieter. But the quiet has depth to it, the way a lake has depth. What you see from the surface isn't the whole story. Things begin to surface. Not thoughts, not words, images, scenes. A room you haven't been in since you were 7. A conversation you didn't understand at the time and you now realise have been not understanding ever since. The feelings you weren't allowed to have then are here now in this room in Worcestershire, in the body of someone who is very much an adult, and somehow also, simultaneously, still 7 years old in a room where something was happening that wasn't supposed to. You begin to cry, not the careful, polite crying of 4 years of therapy, the other kind, the kind that has been waiting, the kind that knows, somehow, that it finally has enough time. Sanderson doesn't move from his chair in the corner. This is the correct choice. You don't need him to come closer. You need someone to be there. He is there. The thing that was sitting behind your ribs for 4 years is no longer behind your ribs. You can see it. You can look at it directly. It doesn't move this time. 7 hours later, Sanderson asks you how you are. You don't have a good answer. You're tired in the specific way that comes after something large has happened. Not unpleasantly tired. Tired the way you're tired after a long day in which something important occurred. The kind of tired that comes with a sense of completion rather than depletion. The room is a normal room again. The clock makes its sound. The curtains are the curtains. You are, however, quite sure that something has changed. You can't fully articulate what. You're not going to try tonight. Tomorrow morning you'll wake up and the familiar dread, the one that usually greets you before you've even fully remembered what you are, won't be there. Or rather, it will be there, but smaller. Like something seen from a greater distance than before. This will last. Not forever. This isn't a cure. Sanderson doesn't call it a cure. But something has been reached that wasn't reachable before. Something has been said that couldn't be said before. You will come back in 3 weeks and do this again, and each time you will go a little further into the part of yourself that used to move when you looked at it. By the time the course of treatment is finished, the thing that had been waiting behind your ribs for years will no longer be waiting. It will have become something you've looked at, something you understand, something that is, now, just part of you. Not a locked room with no key, just a room. You will think about this day in Powick Hospital, Worcestershire, for the rest of your life. That experience, in that specific room, with that specific intention, was also happening in rooms that looked nothing like this one. It started in a laboratory in Basel, Switzerland in the spring of 1943. Albert Hoffman was not a dramatic man. His lab coat probably had a lab coat. His handwriting looked like it had been approved by 3 separate committees. He organised things. He documented things. He was the kind of chemist who found genuine satisfaction in the quiet precision of synthesis. The way you could follow a process and, if you followed it correctly, arrive at exactly what you'd set out to find. He had not set out to find what he found. 5 years earlier, in 1938, Hoffman had synthesized a compound called lysergic acid diethylamide, which he catalogued as LSD-25, because it was the 25th compound in a series he'd been developing from ergot alkaloids, a fungus that grows on rye. The intended application was medical, something to do with circulation, possibly respiration. Sandoz Laboratories was interested in ergot compounds for their potential as pharmaceuticals. He tested it on animals. The animals became restless. Nothing else interesting happened. He wrote it up. He shelved it. And then, 5 years later, on the 16th of April 1943, he resynthesized it. He would later say he had a peculiar feeling. An intuition, of the kind that serious scientists usually attribute to rigorous methodology and privately admit might sometimes be something else. He wanted to look at LSD 25 again. He wasn't sure why. He synthesized a fresh batch. During the final stages of purification, he absorbed a small amount through his fingertips. Within 40 minutes, he had to stop working. His laboratory report from that day describes not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. He noticed unusual visual sensations. He went home. He lay down. He closed his eyes and watched, with a mixture of professional interest and personal alarm, as an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colours, moved through his vision. After about 2 hours, it stopped. He was fine. He was also very curious. He suspected the LSD 25. He wrote in his laboratory notes that a tiny amount had apparently caused a remarkable, but not unpleasant experience. He noted the obvious professional question. How tiny was tiny? What exactly was the threshold? 3 days later, April the 19th, 1943, Hoffman decided to find out. He prepared 1/4 milligram, 250 micrograms, and ingested it. He considered this a conservative minimal dose. It was, in fact, 2.5 times the amount required to produce a full psychedelic experience in most human beings. He recorded the time as 4:40 in the afternoon. 40 minutes later he wrote in his notes, beginning dizziness, feeling of anxiety, visual distortions, symptoms of paralysis, desire to laugh. Then he stopped writing. He was finding it difficult to speak in complete sentences, let alone hold a pen. He asked his laboratory assistant to take him home. Because it was wartime Switzerland and private cars were restricted, they went by bicycle. This is the part of the story that historians call Bicycle Day, with a straight face, which, when you think about what was happening to Hoffman's perception of reality during this bicycle ride, is perhaps the most understated piece of nomenclature in the history of pharmacology. He was on the highest dose of the most potent psychedelic compound ever synthesized, pedaling through the streets of Basel, while the world took on qualities that bicycle rides do not typically have. He later described the ride as follows. Houses appeared to collapse and fall, the sky turned various shades of moving colour. He perceived himself as remaining stationary while the landscape rushed past him, and at some point he became convinced, not suspected, but convinced, that he had somehow poisoned himself and was about to die. His assistant, cycling alongside, reported that he seemed to be riding perfectly normally. This gap, between what a person experiencing a large dose of LSD believes is happening and what outside observers can actually observe, is one of the central facts about the drug. It would matter enormously over the next 20 years. When they arrived home, Hoffman's neighbour came over. He later described her as having transformed in his perception into a malevolent, insidious witch. She was, he clarified in subsequent writing, a perfectly normal neighbour who was doing nothing threatening whatsoever. She brought him milk. The milk, he noted, tasted extraordinary. A doctor arrived and examined him. His pupils were massively dilated. His pulse was elevated. Otherwise, he was physically fine. He was not, however, experiencing a physically fine time. The experience in the second half of the evening, once the worst of the anxiety had passed, he described as remarkable. The room moved. The furniture had opinions about its own existence. Colours appeared to him with an intensity he had no previous vocabulary for. He lay on his sofa and watched his ceiling perform a kind of slow, patient transformation that he would spend the next 50 years trying to adequately describe. The next morning he woke up. He was fine. He was also completely clear-headed in a way that felt somehow enhanced. as if the lens had been cleaned. He went into the garden. The world looked, he wrote, newly created. He had created something extraordinary. He knew this immediately. He also had no idea what to do with it. Sandoz was interested. Hoffman wrote up his findings. The company began sending samples, small glass vials, a fraction of a gram, enough for hundreds of doses, to psychiatric researchers across Europe. The cover letter essentially said, "Here is a new compound. We believe it may be useful in psychotherapy. The psychiatrist may wish to administer it to patients to facilitate access to unconscious material. The psychiatrist may also wish to take it personally in order to better understand the psychotic states their patients experience." This sentence, "the psychiatrist may also wish to take it personally," is worth pausing on. Sandoz's marketing literature was suggesting, as a professional recommendation, that the person prescribing the drug should also ingest the drug themselves, for research. Hundreds of European psychiatrists did exactly that. In the 1950s, completely professionally. At conferences this was discussed. Papers were published. A psychiatrist who hadn't personally tried LSD was considered in some circles not fully equipped to work with it therapeutically. This will not strike you as a normal way to develop a pharmaceutical product. It was not a normal pharmaceutical product. By 1947, Sandoz had given the compound a trade name, Delicid. The recommended uses, as stated in the official product literature, were: first, as an adjunct to psychotherapy, to reduce patient defensiveness and allow access to repressed emotional material. Second, for psychiatrists to take themselves to produce a temporary state resembling psychosis and thereby develop a deeper understanding of their patients' experiences. This was the legitimate, above-board, original intended market for LSD. Not a recreational drug, not a weapon, a psychiatric tool distributed by a major Swiss pharmaceutical company to credentialed researchers who requested it, often for free. Sandoz sent samples anywhere a researcher asked. If you had an institutional address and a plausible research interest, a small package from Basel arrived in the post. Across Europe and North America, laboratories and psychiatric clinics began receiving vials of Delicid in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the way today you might receive samples of a new antidepressant, except this was considerably stranger, considerably more potent, and considerably less understood. The mail was moving faster than the framework for understanding what was in it. The first American experiments began in 1950. A psychiatrist named Max Rinkel had made contact with Sandoz during a visit to Europe and brought the compound back to Boston Psychopathic Hospital, which, despite the name, was a respected research institution and not a place where the name should alarm anyone. Rinkel gave LSD to 100 volunteers, not patients, healthy volunteers, mostly hospital staff and graduate students. People who had agreed to participate in a study of what this new compound did to normal human perception. They were given a dose, placed in a room, and observed. Researchers took notes. This was, by the standards of 1950, a rigorous study. The volunteers' session reports read like dispatches from somewhere that shouldn't exist but clearly does. They reported geometric patterns moving behind their closed eyelids, the sensation of their body boundaries dissolving, the usual hard line between self and room softening, becoming porous, colours they described as more saturated than normal, as if someone had turned up a dial they didn't previously know existed, time moving strangely. Some felt minutes had lasted hours, others felt hours had collapsed to nothing. Several described what they could only call a sense of contact with something larger than themselves, some quality of the experience they couldn't name but felt certain was real. One researcher wrote a careful note. Subject reports that music appears to have spatial dimensions. This was documented as an anomalous perceptual effect. It did not occur to him to wonder if the subject might be right. The conviction, in several cases, that they had just experienced the most significant event of their lives. One or two described it as terrifying. Most described it as astonishing. Several said, when it was over, that they were not entirely sure how to go back to whatever they had been doing before. Not because they were impaired, because the previous condition suddenly seemed like it might have been the impairment. Wrinkle presented his findings to the American Psychiatric Association. His conclusion: LSD produces a temporary model psychosis, a reversible state resembling schizophrenia, useful for understanding the condition from the inside. The framework was psychotomimetic, from the Greek, mimicking psychosis. The idea was that LSD produced in a healthy brain something structurally similar to what a schizophrenic patient experienced all the time. If you could produce the experience experimentally, you could study it. If you could study it, you might understand schizophrenia. If you understood schizophrenia, you might eventually treat it. This logic was not unreasonable. It was, in hindsight, also missing most of what was actually happening in the room. The volunteers weren't describing a temporary malfunction. They were describing something that felt to them like an expansion, a temporarily broader band of experience, not a narrower one. But the available scientific frame was this resembles psychosis, and available frames tend to be used. The volunteer who said the music had spatial dimensions was documented as experiencing an anomalous perceptual effect. Nobody asked him if it was accurate. In Worcestershire, Ronald Sanderson was using a different frame. Sanderson had trained in the tradition of Carl Jung. He was interested in the symbolic content of mental experience, the idea that the images, feelings and associations produced by the mind were not random noise but meaningful material, the kind that therapy was trying to reach. He opened the world's first dedicated LSD psychotherapy clinic at Powick Hospital in 1952. He had 36 patients. He kept careful notes. He was the kind of clinician who found the notes as interesting as the outcomes. The patients who came to him had largely exhausted other options. Years of conventional talk therapy that had moved slowly or not at all. Conditions that had names: severe neurosis, anxiety, depression, traumatic histories, but hadn't responded to the treatments those names usually attracted. They came to a clinic in a Worcestershire hospital partly because someone had suggested it, partly because they had run out of things to try. The sessions ran long. 8 hours was common, 12 hours was not unusual. The patient arrived in the morning. Sanderson gave them a dose, small at first, increasing over subsequent sessions as the patient became familiar with the experience. They lay on a couch. The room was quiet. Music sometimes played. Sanderson preferred classical, something without words that could carry emotion without directing it. The patient was encouraged to close their eyes and let whatever came come. What came, repeatedly in patients who'd been unable to access it through years of conventional therapy, was the material that had been driving their symptoms, not as a vague sense of sadness, not as a distant awareness of some difficult early experience, but as vivid, present, sensory memory, the specific room, the specific face, the specific moment, not remembered, re-experienced. The distinction, Sanderson found, mattered enormously. A patient could know, intellectually, that something difficult had happened to them without having any access to what it had felt like to be the person it happened to. LSD, in the therapeutic setting, appeared to restore that access. Some patients cried for hours, some went through periods of intense fear, some laughed, some were silent for the entire session, moving through something internal that Sanderson could see by their expression, but not enter. The role of the therapist, he decided, was not to interpret during the session, not to suggest, direct, or analyze. It was to be present. A calm, reliable presence in a room where unusual things were happening. Someone the patient knew they could call on and who would not be frightened by what was unfolding. The results, across his 36 patients, were quietly extraordinary. Conditions that hadn't responded to years of conventional treatment began to shift. The thing that had been sitting behind the ribs, the thing that moved when looked at directly, became, under LSD, something that could be approached, something with a shape and a history, something that, once seen clearly, could begin to be understood rather than merely endured. This is not the story most people know about LSD in the 1950s. This is the one that actually happened in the majority of those quiet clinical rooms before the other stories arrived and drowned it out. Meanwhile, across an ocean, in a government office in Washington, someone was reading a report about LSD and asking an entirely different set of questions. Not, what does this feel like from the inside? Not, what does this allow a patient to reach? But, if this can change what a person perceives, if it can make a neighbour's face look like a witch, if it can make a man on a bicycle believe he isn't moving, what else might it make a person believe? And if you could make someone believe the wrong thing, could you make them say the wrong thing? And if you could make them say the wrong thing, could you make them say anything at all? The question arrived at the desk of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1951. It was the beginning of a very different kind of room. The Sandoz cover letter had 2 recommendations. The first, give it to your patients. The second, take it yourself, so that you understand what your patients are going through, so you know the territory before you try to guide anyone through it. This was not a fringe suggestion. It was printed in the official Sandoz product literature. A major Swiss pharmaceutical company in the late 1940s, distributing a substance to psychiatric clinics across Europe and North America with a cover letter that essentially said, "Here is a new compound. Try it on your patients and also try it yourself." Hundreds of psychiatrists did exactly that, in their offices, their homes, their consulting rooms. Some took it with colleagues present, treating the session as a collaborative professional exercise. 2 clinicians, 2 experiences, cross-referencing observations. Some took it alone, some documented meticulously. Some found documentation difficult because the part of them that normally performed documentation had temporarily become something else entirely. This was not considered reckless. It was considered professionally responsible, thorough, the kind of thing a serious clinician did. What the psychiatrist finds the first time is this: he is prepared carefully. He has read Hoffman's notes and Sanderson's early papers. He has taken a modest dose, somewhere between 50 and 100 micrograms, enough to produce noticeable effects without overwhelming them. He's sitting in his consulting room, the same chair he always sits in, the one behind the desk with the view of the garden he never quite looks at. He has a notebook open, a pen in his hand. He is, as much as he can be, ready. For the first 30 minutes he writes normally. Observations about his perceptual state, clinical language, the kind of sentences that fit in a notebook without complaint. Then the sentences start to feel like the wrong shape for what he's trying to put in them. Not because his thinking has become impaired, because it has become, in some difficult to specify way, more than usual. The thoughts are arriving with an unusual speed and clarity, not racing, not chaotic, but sharper than ordinary. There is a quality to his awareness that he recognizes immediately as not his normal Tuesday morning consciousness. Something has been turned up. He looks at his hand holding the pen. He has looked at his hand holding a pen approximately 10,000 times in his professional life. He has never actually looked at it before. He puts the pen down. He sits with what is happening for several hours. Some of it is beautiful. Some of it is strange in a way that is also somehow clarifying, like a long-stuck window being opened. At one point, and he will write about this later, carefully trying to be precise, he finds himself understanding with sudden and almost embarrassing clarity why one of his most resistant patients cannot change. Not intellectually understanding, actually seeing it, the structure of the pattern, the logic of the trap the patient lives in, visible to him now as if someone had made it three-dimensional. He thinks, why couldn't I see this before? I've been talking to this man for 3 years. Why couldn't I see this? He will not be able to fully explain, in the session notes he writes the next morning, where the insight came from, or what exactly had changed in his perception to make it possible. He will note with characteristic clinical restraint that the experience produced observations he considers clinically significant. He will take it again. Most of his colleagues will too. This is the version of the 1950s LSD story, with no dramatic arc, no villain, no tragedy. Just a group of psychiatrists who tried what their pharmaceutical supplier suggested, found it illuminating, and quietly became better at their jobs. History has almost entirely forgotten them, because in 1951 something else was happening. A question had arrived in Washington. Not a scientific question, a strategic one. And the difference matters enormously, especially when the people asking it work for an organization whose job is, broadly speaking, to make problems disappear before anyone finds out they existed. The problem was this. American prisoners of war returning from Korea were appearing in newsreels making statements they should not have been making. Confessing, renouncing, saying with apparent sincerity that they had been wrong about the war, wrong about their country, wrong about things Americans were not supposed to be wrong about. The official position was that no one did this voluntarily. They had to have been made to do it. The word that entered the vocabulary was brainwashing. Someone had to find the American version. The job landed on Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb had a club foot, a stutter, a doctorate in chemistry from Caltech, and a goat farm in rural Virginia. He was a folk dancer with genuine enthusiasm for the form, the kind that made colleagues uncertain how to respond at office functions. He grew Christmas trees, he composted, he made his own yogurt. He was also, without any apparent sense of contradiction, the head of the CIA's technical services staff, and he was about to run the most expensive and least scientifically rigorous human experimentation program in the history of American intelligence. His colleagues described him in contradictions, brilliant but ruthless, idealistic but expedient. A man who said grace before meals and authorized non-consensual human dosing experiments before lunch, and appeared to experience no friction between these two activities. The goats were real, the yogurt was real, the folk dancing was real, so were the experiments. The program was MK Ultra, officially 1953, though its predecessor had been running since 51. Over 150 sub-projects. Every substance and technique that had ever been suggested as a means to manipulate human consciousness. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, heroin, mescaline, electroconvulsive therapy administered without medical indication, sleep deprivation. The program was ambitious, well-funded, and almost entirely classified, which meant it answered to no one who might have objected to its methods. But LSD was the one Gottlieb kept returning to. The logic was almost elegant. If LSD could dissolve a person's sense of self, could make a man on a bicycle believe he wasn't moving, could transform a neighbour's face into something demonic, then surely it could dissolve the structures that made a trained operative resistant. Surely a person mid-experience would be unable to maintain the careful architecture of a cover story. Surely the truth would surface, the way things surface when everything else has been stripped away. The logic was almost elegant. The actual results were not. The CIA did not approach LSD the way Sanderson approached it in Worcestershire, or the way the psychiatrist in his consulting room approached it. They did not approach it scientifically at all. Where the legitimate researchers used consent, the CIA used surprise. Where legitimate researchers created calm environments designed to minimize anxiety, the CIA created environments that were deliberately stressful because they believed the drug would work better when the subject was already frightened. Where legitimate researchers stayed with their subjects, the CIA observed through one-way mirrors and took notes. What they produced consistently was not confessions, it was chaos. A person given a large dose of LSD without warning, in a room designed to disorient them, surrounded by authority figures they couldn't read, while the floor of their own perception was giving way. That person did not tell the truth. They told everything, which is not the same thing. They said whatever surfaced. They panicked. They laughed at nothing. They became incoherent, then catatonic, then occasionally lucid enough to say something alarming before becoming incoherent again. None of this was useful. None of this was repeatable in any controlled sense. Their own records show this clearly. A CIA memo from the surviving files notes that LSD appears to enhance suggestibility while simultaneously making the subject's responses unreliable and difficult to evaluate. This is bureaucratic language for it works and it doesn't work at the same time, which is the definition of a tool that doesn't work. The recommendation at the bottom of the memo was further study. Further study produced the same results. The recommendation was further study. The United States government is very good at recommending further study of things that have been studied sufficiently to reach a conclusion when the conclusion is inconvenient. This particular cycle of study, result, and recommendation ran for approximately a decade. By the time it ended, the program had dosed prisoners, hospital patients, military personnel, and the paying clients of sex workers in San Francisco safe houses, and had produced approximately no actionable intelligence and a substantial quantity of paperwork that would later be shredded. In November of 1953, Gottlieb organized a retreat. Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, a remote cabin. A small group of CIA scientists and operatives. The agenda included project discussions, a nature walk, and after-dinner drinks. The after-dinner Cointreau on the second evening contained LSD. Gottlieb added it before it was poured. He didn't tell anyone. One of the men at the table was Frank Olsen, 43 years old, biological weapons researcher, wife named Alice, 3 kids, coached his son's baseball team. A quiet, competent man who had recently begun to feel uncomfortable about some of what he knew. That evening, he noticed something was wrong with the drink. He didn't know what. He knew something. It was an evening in November. The fire was doing what fires do. The conversation was doing what government conversations do. Careful, professional, slightly performative. The Cointreau was slightly sweet, slightly warm. Olsen had 1 glass and poured a second. Within the hour, the edges of the room began to soften. Not dramatically. Not the way a film would show it. Subtler than that. The wood panelling across the room became more textured than wood panelling normally is. The grain of it more present, more specific, as if he were seeing it for the first time. The face of the man speaking shifted into something more alive than faces normally are. He blinked. It didn't change. His thoughts were moving faster than usual and in directions he hadn't intended. He tried to follow a sentence and found that each word arrived correctly, but the space between them was becoming slippery. He understood every individual part. The whole was coming apart. He considered excusing himself. He considered whether he was ill. He considered, and then immediately dismissed, and then could not dismiss, the possibility that something was deeply wrong. Then the wood panelling began to move. The grain of it shifted. slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way water moves just below the surface when something passes through it. Frank Olsen was a scientist. He had spent 15 years thinking about invisible things, bacteria, aerosols, the ways in which small particles moved through air and entered bodies. He had categories for most things. He did not have a category for this. He had no guide, no preparation, no warning, no framework, no off switch. He spent the next several hours believing he was losing his mind. He was not losing his mind. He was inside the same molecule that Sanderson's patients in Worcestershire swallowed willingly on Tuesday mornings, lying on a couch with a therapist in the corner. The molecule was identical. Everything surrounding it was not. The next morning, Gottlieb told the group what he'd given them. He called it an experiment in group dynamics. He offered an apology the records suggest lasted about as long as it took to say the words. Frank Olsen was not all right. He didn't get better. Over the following days, he became quieter, more withdrawn. He said he wanted to leave government work. He said he was carrying things he could no longer carry comfortably. He wasn't specific. He was specific enough. The CIA gave him a handler rather than a leave of absence. He was brought to New York, placed in the care of a CIA-connected psychiatrist named Harold Abramson, who was also, in a detail that surprises no one of the researchers the CIA was funding for LSD work, not an independent physician, an employee of the organization that had caused the distress, assigned to contain the distress. They checked into the Hotel Statler on the 24th of November, 1953. 4 days later, at 2:30 in the morning, Frank Olsen went through the window of room 1018. 10th floor, he died in the street. Official verdict, suicide. Alice Olsen was told her husband had a nervous breakdown. The children were told their father died. No one told them what had been in the Cointreau. For 22 years, no one outside the program knew his name. In 1975, the Senate's Church Committee found what remained of the MKUltra records, 20,000 documents that survived only because they'd been misfiled in a financial building and missed the shredder that Richard Helms ran in 1973, 2 years before the investigation, with Gottlieb's personal assistance. Enough to tell the story, not enough to prosecute anyone. In 1994, Eric Olsen, who had been 9 years old when his father fell, had the body exhumed. A forensic anthropologist found a contusion above the left eye inconsistent with a fall from a window. The CIA's position, tragic accident, matter closed. The matter has never been closed. Eric Olsen is still alive. On the other side of the continent, at approximately the same time, in a provincial hospital on the Canadian prairies with no budget and no government interest, and no one watching, a British psychiatrist named Humphrey Osmond was getting results that nobody in Washington would have believed. Osmond was treating alcoholics, which was, in the 1950s, psychiatry's most reliably humbling specialty. Nothing worked reliably. 12-step programs helped some people. Therapy helped some people. Willpower was the standard recommendation and the standard failure. The honest consensus, among clinicians who'd worked the field long enough, was that severe alcoholism might simply be unbeatable, that the best you could do was manage it, slow it, and hope. Osmond had a counterintuitive theory. Alcoholics who survived delirium tremens, the terrifying hallucinations of severe withdrawal, occasionally emerged with a changed relationship to drinking. Something about hitting the absolute floor of experience, surviving it, seemed to rearrange something. What if you could produce a controlled version of that? Something with the intensity of the worst moment without the danger. He gave his patients LSD high dose. 1 or 2 sessions. Carefully prepared. Osmond spent hours with each patient beforehand, explaining what would happen, making the room right, making sure they were not alone. The music was chosen, the light was considered, nothing was left to accident that could be controlled. Then he sat with them for 8, 10, 12 hours, through whatever came. What Osmond observed, session after session, was that his patients went somewhere during those hours. Not nowhere, somewhere specific, somewhere they recognised, even if they had spent years not going there. What came, in the room of a man who'd been drinking for 20 years, was often this. He had been in this room before, not this hospital room, the other one, the one from before the drinking started, or the one where it started, or the one where something happened that made the drinking make sense for a while, and then make sense for longer, and then become the thing he needed, and then become the thing he was. He had not been in that room for years. He had in fact spent considerable resources, financial, physical, emotional, ensuring he never had to go back there. The LSD did not take him there. He took himself there. The drug simply removed the lock. The hours passed in a way hours don't normally pass, some of them slowly, some of them not at all, some of them appearing to contain other hours inside them. Osmond was in the corner, present but not intrusive. The patient cried in a way he hadn't cried since before he learned that crying was something he didn't do. He said things out loud that he'd never said out loud. He understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical in its precision, the exact shape of the thing that had driven him, the architecture of the trap. And understanding it from outside was different from being inside it. He could look at it. For the first time he could look directly at it, and it didn't move. The session ended. Osmond made tea. The next day they talked about what had emerged. Something had shifted. Not everything, not permanently. But the thing he had been drinking to avoid had a face now, and things with faces are different from things without them. They can be approached. They can sometimes be put down. Roughly half of Osmond's patients showed significant improvement or long-term sobriety at follow-up. In a field where that number hovered in the low single digits, this was not a modest result. This was the kind of result that should have rearranged priorities. It produced a paper that some people read. In Saskatchewan, Osmond kept looking for people who might take it seriously. One of them was Aldous Huxley. In May of 1953, Osmond visited Huxley in Los Angeles. Huxley was the author of Brave New World, a man who had spent his career thinking about consciousness and power and what it meant to be alive in a modern state. He'd been corresponding with Osmond about whether chemical substances could access states of experience that ordinary consciousness couldn't reach. He was curious in the way only a particular kind of very serious intellectual can be curious, not casually, but with the full weight of a mind that had been thinking about the question for years. Osmond gave him mescaline. Huxley sat in his garden. He looked at a vase of flowers for a very long time. What he later wrote about was not the flowers, it was what the flowers actually were, the quality of existence underneath the appearance. The way, in ordinary consciousness, you look at a flower and process it as information. Rose, red, garden, pleasant. Under mescaline, the processing stopped. The thing itself remained. He described looking at the folds in his own trousers and finding in them the same quality. The sheer fact of their existence, their particular texture and presence, felt as acutely as if he were encountering fabric for the first time. A chair leg was the same. The grain of a wooden table was the same. Everything was temporarily equally real, equally there, in a way that ordinary consciousness, with its relentless editing and categorizing, prevented. He said it felt like perception without the filter, like the narrowing that makes daily life manageable had briefly opened, and what was underneath was not chaos, but a kind of extraordinary plain reality that had always been present and simply hadn't been attended to. He was, at the time, one of the most celebrated writers in the English language. He had written Brave New World. He had spent his career thinking about consciousness, power, the question of what human experience could be. He was not a man prone to mysticism or imprecision. When he wrote about what he'd seen in his California garden, he wrote about it with the careful language of a man who understood exactly what he was claiming and was choosing to claim it anyway. He wrote a book about it, The Doors of Perception, from a line of William Blake, published 1954. It was not written for a counterculture that didn't yet exist. It was written for the people who read Aldous Huxley, serious, educated readers who took seriously what serious minds said about serious questions. Those readers read it, filed something away and went on with their lives. The filing mattered. An idea had been deposited in a particular stratum of culture, that these substances offered something real, not a malfunction, not a disease state, something worth having. That idea would sit undisturbed in that particular stratum until the stratum cracked open. It was about to crack open. In 1957, Osmond wrote Huxley a letter about a problem of language. The scientific term for LSD and mescaline was psychotomimetic, mimicking psychosis. The problem, Osmond argued, was that this name had already decided what the experience was: disease state, malfunction. The name made the therapeutic possibility almost invisible, because if you named a thing after its pathological resemblance, you couldn't then argue the resemblance was wrong. He proposed a new word, from the Greek, psyche and delos, mind manifesting, not mind destroying, mind revealing, psychedelic. Huxley wrote back with something more poetic. Osmond replied, "Yours works better in a poem, mine works better in a clinical paper." He was right about both. The word entered the language quietly. A letter. Saskatchewan to California. Researchers adopted it first, then journalists, then the kind of people who would take it somewhere Osmond had never imagined sending it. By 1967, it would be on the cover of Time magazine. By then, the alcoholism results and the therapeutic protocols and the years of careful documentation would be disappearing beneath it, buried under a word Osmond had invented to describe something precise, now carrying a meaning he had never intended. The rooms were about to get considerably more crowded, and the people filling them had very different ideas about what the experiment was for. While Osmond was in Saskatchewan, and Sanderson was in Worcestershire, and the psychiatrists across Europe were sitting in their consulting rooms with notebooks and pen, and a substance that kept making the notebooks feel inadequate. The CIA was not the only American institution that had noticed LSD. The Army had also noticed. The Army's interest was different from the CIA's. The CIA wanted a truth serum. The Army wanted something simpler and more honest about its intentions, an incapacitating agent. Something you could deliver to enemy troops that would temporarily disable them without killing them. Not a weapon in the conventional sense, more like a very aggressive pause button. If you could make a regiment of soldiers unable to hold weapons, recognize colleagues, understand orders, or agree on what was real, you had, tactically speaking, a significant advantage. LSD seemed promising. It was extraordinarily potent at tiny doses. You could deliver a militarily significant amount in a quantity small enough to be aerosolized, contaminated into a water supply, or applied to a surface. It produced, reliably, a state in which the person experiencing it was essentially useless for anything requiring coordination, judgment, or a stable relationship with external reality. And unlike nerve agents or conventional chemical weapons, it didn't kill. The Geneva Convention had things to say about killing. It was quieter on the subject of temporarily making someone believe the ground was breathing. The Army began testing at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Between 1955 and 1967, an estimated 1,500 American military personnel were given LSD at Edgewood Arsenal and associated facilities. Most of them were told they were testing equipment. Not all of them were told anything at all. The doses used were not the careful, graduated amounts used in therapeutic sessions in Europe. They were not the modest, self-experimental quantities the psychiatrists had taken at their desks. They were, in several documented cases, doses an order of magnitude larger than anything used therapeutically, quantities calculated to produce maximum disorientation rather than therapeutic access. The army filmed some of these sessions. The footage exists. It shows men in uniform who cannot walk straight, men who sit down on the floor in the middle of an open field and stay there, men who attempt to complete assigned tasks, march in formation, operate a radio, identify a target, and find that the relationship between intention and action has become approximate rather than reliable. Men who are laughing at things that aren't there. Men who have stopped trying to complete their tasks and are examining their own hands with the absorbed concentration of someone who has never seen hands before. One veteran, testifying years later, described being placed in a room with 7 other soldiers he had served with for months. Within an hour he could not recognize any of their faces. The session reports describe it in clinical language. The clinical language doesn't quite cover it. It was a morning in Maryland. A soldier, one of roughly 1,500 who passed through the Edgewood program, arrived for what he'd been told was an equipment test. The army tested equipment constantly. He had signed paperwork. He was in a room with 7 other men from his unit. He had eaten breakfast. Someone handed him something to drink. Somewhere in the first hour, Private Morrison's face was wrong. Not monstrous, not transformed. Just wrong in a way that was difficult to locate. Doing too much, every expression arriving with an extra layer of meaning that couldn't be decoded. The soldier looked at Sergeant Harris instead. Harris was also wrong. More present than usual, more alive than faces normally are. The wall was doing something walls don't do. He understood, at some clinical distance from what was happening, that something had occurred in his body. The distance between his thoughts had started expanding in a way that felt less like thinking and more like watching thoughts happen to him. He tried to remember what he'd been told about the equipment he was testing. He could not locate the memory. He knew it existed. He could not find it. Someone gave an order. He heard the words. Each word was a known word. The sentence they formed had the shape of an order, the rhythm of military instruction. He understood every individual element. He could not connect them into an action. The gap between hearing the order and knowing what to do with it was approximately the same size as the room, and the floor had developed an uncertain quality, and Morrison's face was still wrong, and Sergeant Harris had sat down on the floor. He sat down next to him. They stayed there for a long time. The army's observer in the corner was writing something in a notebook. The session ended. Eventually, food and water. A ride back to the barracks. Nobody told him what he'd been given. Some of the men in that room would ask questions for the rest of their lives and receive answers that satisfied the evidence slightly less with each telling. Some would develop symptoms they could not attribute to a cause, because the cause was classified. Some would find, years later, a Senate hearing on television, and would sit very still while a senator read from a document, and would understand, in that moment, what the equipment test had actually been. The Army's conclusion from the Edgewood Arsenal program was that LSD worked as an incapacitating agent in the technical sense. It did indeed incapacitate, but was too unpredictable to be militarily useful. The duration was too long. 8 to 12 hours was not a battlefield timeline. The effects were too variable between individuals. One soldier would become catatonic, another would become agitated, another would become so absorbed in the texture of the grass that he was functionally absent but not visibly incapacitated, which created tactical complications. There was no antidote. You couldn't incapacitate an enemy regiment at noon and then reliably clear them at 3. The aerosolization problem was significant too. The quantities needed to dose a meaningful number of enemy soldiers through environmental delivery, through water supply contamination or aerial dispersal, were theoretically achievable, but practically complicated. LSD degrades rapidly in sunlight. Wind patterns are unpredictable. The mathematics of reliable open-air delivery were not in the Army's favour. The programme wound down. The results were classified. The Army moved to other compounds, principally BZ, a deliriant related to scopolamine, far more incapacitating and with a more controllable duration. BZ made LSD look like a strong cup of coffee. The Army found it more promising and less philosophically complicated, which is saying something about BZ rather than LSD. LSD was filed under promising but impractical. The Edgewood files were classified. The veterans went home with no paperwork explaining what they had been given, no follow-up medical care for symptoms that might be related to what they had been given, and no legal recourse for several decades. In the 1980s and 90s, some of them began finding each other, comparing notes, discovering that other men from their units had experienced similar things, the strange tests, the unexplained sessions, the forms they'd signed that seemed, in retrospect, to have covered rather more ground than equipment testing usually requires. Some filed suits, most lost. The classified nature of the program made evidence difficult to obtain and impossible to compel. A handful received medical evaluations, a smaller handful received acknowledgement. The Army's position, when asked, was that the experiments had been conducted within the guidelines of the time. The guidelines of the time did not include telling the subjects what they were taking. The CIA, meanwhile, had developed a parallel program that was less interested in military utility and more interested in something harder to describe. Operation Midnight Climax began in 1955. George White, a Bureau of Narcotics officer contracted by the CIA, set up a safe house on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco, an apartment furnished nicely. White had taste, or at least understood what taste was supposed to look like. A bar stocked with good liquor, a kitchen, art on the walls, the kind of place a certain kind of confident, moderately successful San Francisco man might maintain. Behind one wall, a one-way mirror. Behind the mirror, George White, or one of his observers, with a martini and a notepad. White was a large, forceful man who had spent his career in federal narcotics enforcement, the kind of career that gave a person extensive professional knowledge of drugs, a deep contempt for the people who used them, and apparently no sense of irony about the gap between those two things. He had worked undercover. He had run informants. He was good at the mechanics of surveillance and not particularly troubled by the ethics of it. The CIA had approached him because they needed someone who could run the operational side of this particular program, managing the sex workers, handling logistics, maintaining the apartment, observing the subjects, without asking too many questions. White did not ask too many questions. He appeared, by the evidence of his diary, to find the whole thing genuinely enjoyable. The sex workers White contracted were briefed as CIA assets assisting a national security operation. They were paid well. Their instructions were to bring clients back to the apartment, encourage drinking, keep them comfortable, and ensure they stayed long enough for the substance to take effect. The stated purpose: test whether LSD could extract useful information from unwitting targets in real-world conditions. The theory was that laboratory settings were too artificial, that the drug needed genuine circumstances, a real subject with something to conceal, before its interrogation potential could be properly assessed. This theory had problems. There were no controls, no consistent methodology, no way to compare results across different subjects on different evenings, with different amounts of alcohol already in their systems. No way to know whether any particular response was produced by the drug, the context, individual variation, or the quality of the scotch. George White, in his private diary, described the operation as the most enjoyable job in the government. He expanded it in 1961 to a second location in New York. The program ran until 1965. The clients who stumbled out of that Telegraph Hill apartment into the San Francisco night were in various conditions, none of them good and none of them understood. One man, who later pursued a lawsuit, described beginning to feel strange approximately 40 minutes after arriving. He had attributed it initially to too much to drink, had tried to leave, been gently discouraged by the woman he was with, had sat back down. By the time he understood something more than alcohol was involved, understanding was becoming difficult. He described the room rotating slowly. He described attempting to locate the door and finding that the door kept being in a different position than he expected. He described a period of several hours he could not account for. He was outside before dawn. He did not know what had happened to him. He would not find out for years. By then, most of the records were gone. White closed the San Francisco operation in 1965. He retired and moved to Stinson Beach. In a letter written near the end of his life, he reflected on his career in law enforcement and intelligence. He described the Midnight Climax work fondly. He noted that it had been, in his estimation, genuinely valuable. He did not specify to whom. There is a photograph, taken somewhere in the mid-1950s, of 3 of the people most responsible for LSD's expansion into the world during this period. The photograph doesn't exist. It's a composite, assembled from evidence rather than from a camera, but picture it anyway. On the left, Humphrey Osmond, composing a letter in a prairie hospital office, proposing a word that will eventually describe something he never imagined. His desk is modest. The window looks out on a Saskatchewan winter. He's trying to solve a problem of language because he believes language shapes what is possible, and the current language is making the impossible seem inevitable. He has good results and no audience, and an absolute conviction that both of these things are temporary. In the middle, George White, sitting behind a one-way mirror on Telegraph Hill with martini and a government notepad, watching a man in the furnished apartment on the other side try to understand why the room is moving. White's diary entry for this evening will be brief and satisfied. He considers himself a patriot. He is not wrong that he considers himself a patriot. He is wrong about most of the other things. On the right, Sanderson in Worcestershire, sitting in his corner chair, the chair he always sits in during sessions, while a patient lies on the couch and works through something that has been waiting for years. He is not writing anything. He is simply present. The room is quiet. The clock on the wall makes its small, deliberate sound. Outside the window, the English countryside is being whatever the English countryside is in whatever season it is. Sanderson is available if he's needed. He is not needed yet. One substance. 3 completely different definitions of what an experiment was for. The molecule, needless to say, had no opinion on any of this. It did what it did in all 3 rooms with equal indifference. And then, in 1960, a 4th person entered the picture. He was a Harvard psychologist named Timothy Leary. He was 40 years old, professionally ambitious, intellectually restless, and on vacation in Cuernavaca, Mexico, when his host offered him what the locals called magic mushrooms. Leary was the kind of person who said yes to things. He sat in a garden in the Mexican afternoon. His host had told him what to expect and what not to expect, which was apparently not quite enough preparation, because what Leary experienced over the next several hours was, by his own description, not what he had expected. What he didn't expect was this. Leary was a psychologist. He studied human behavior scientifically. He had spent 15 years accumulating a specific kind of certainty, the certainty of a man who had learned to observe, to measure, to keep the observing self and the observed material at a professional distance from each other. That certainty, in this particular Mexican garden, was leaving him. Not all at once. The first hour was interesting rather than overwhelming. Colours were more saturated than colours normally are. The garden had a quality of being particularly itself. Each plant, each stone, each shadow more specifically present than the general category of garden normally allows for. He was taking mental notes. Then something shifted. The mental note-taking stopped. Not because he decided to stop, because the part of him that took mental notes had become indistinguishable from the thing it was noting. The observer and the observed were the same thing. There was no professional distance. There was no distance of any kind. There was only the garden, the afternoon, the particular quality of light, and a consciousness that had temporarily stopped editing itself into the shape of a Harvard psychologist. This lasted several hours. He came back gradually. The garden reassembled. His name reassembled. The categories returned, one by one. Harvard, psychologist, vacation, Mexico, afternoon. Like furniture being moved back into a room after the floors had been cleaned. But something was different about the room. He didn't know what yet. He would spend the next several years trying to find out at increasing velocity and decreasing scientific caution, with consequences that neither he nor the field he was about to transform could fully anticipate. Leary flew back to Harvard. He had been a researcher. He returned an evangelist. The speed of that conversion, from a professional who studied consciousness to a man convinced he had encountered something that changed the meaning of the word, was remarkable even to the people watching it happen. He began the Harvard psilocybin project. The project at first looked like research. Leary obtained psilocybin legally from a pharmaceutical company. He established protocols. He assembled colleagues, including a young psychologist named Richard Alpert, who would later, after his own transformative experiences, become known as Ram Dass. He submitted paperwork. He attended faculty meetings. He wrote up results and discussed methodology, and did the things a Harvard researcher was supposed to do. Then the methodology began to change. He gave psilocybin to graduate students, to writers, to artists, to musicians, to prisoners at Concord State Prison. The Concord Prison Experiment, the results of which he reported with enormous enthusiasm, and which later, on closer examination by other researchers, turned out to be considerably less definitive than advertised. He gave it to his friends. He gave it to people who seemed interesting. He gave it eventually to undergraduates, which was the line Harvard had drawn. In 1963, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were dismissed from Harvard. The official reason, giving psilocybin to undergraduates, failing to show up to teach, general failure to behave like a Harvard professor. The unofficial reason, they had stopped being researchers and started being something the university did not have a category for. They were not scientists anymore. They were not therapists. They were advocates for an experience, evangelists for a state of consciousness. And Harvard was very clear that this was not what it was paying them to be. The dismissal made the front pages. Leary, who had a gift for spectacle that his academic career had so far contained, was now unleashed. He found his phrase quickly: turn on, tune in, drop out. It was not a scientific recommendation. It was not a therapeutic protocol. It was a slogan, and it was the most effective piece of marketing LSD ever received, written by a man who had no idea what it would do to the thing he was marketing. Here is what the dismissal changed. Before 1963, LSD and psilocybin were discussed in psychiatric journals, administered in hospitals and clinics, studied by researchers with institutional affiliations and professional reputations to protect. The conversation happened inside medicine. The public, mostly, hadn't heard of it. After 1963, Leary was on the lecture circuit. He was giving interviews. He was using words like consciousness revolution and the politics of ecstasy. He was meeting Ken Kesey, who had first taken LSD as a paid government volunteer at a Veterans Administration hospital in Menlo Park. Another government experiment, another consequence nobody had planned for, and who had written "One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest" in a ward where the drug was being studied, and who had since organised a group called the Merry Pranksters and was driving a painted bus across America holding events he called acid tests. The acid tests were not clinical trials. They were large, loud, deliberately chaotic parties at which the Grateful Dead played, and LSD was available in the punch, and the lights moved in ways lights were not designed to move, and several hundred people simultaneously discovered that reality was more negotiable than they had been led to believe. Ken Kesey stood in the middle of all of this and found it, apparently, exactly right. Leary and Kesey were not the same person, and did not entirely agree on method or message. But they were pointing in the same direction. Away from the clinic, away from the research facility and the government safe house, toward a public, cultural, non-medical encounter with these substances, toward the experience itself being the point. By 1965, a chemist in Berkeley named Owsley Stanley had begun producing LSD in quantities that made Sandoz's research distribution look like a sample size. Owsley's product was extraordinarily pure, purer in some assessments than pharmaceutical-grade material from Switzerland. He produced an estimated 1 million doses before his first arrest. His clients were the Grateful Dead, the Merry Pranksters, and through those channels anyone who knew anyone who had come to an acid test. The supply chain had left the building. The 40,000 patients and the 1,000 papers and the years of Sanderson's couch and Osmond's prairie work, they were still there, still real, still producing results. But the conversation was elsewhere. Sanderson, in Worcestershire, read the American news with the expression of a man who has handed someone a precise and careful instrument and watched them use it to knock down a wall. He kept seeing his patients. He kept taking notes. The clinic at Powick Hospital continued through the early 1960s, quietly producing results that nobody in Washington or San Francisco or Harvard Yard was watching. In the rooms nobody was watching, the work continued. Outside those rooms, the world had decided it had a different story to tell about what LSD was, and it was about to tell it very loudly, with a Life magazine cover, with a congressional hearing, with a senator using the phrase "threat to American youth" in a tone that made clear he had not read the papers from Saskatchewan, had not been to Worcestershire, and had not spoken to a single one of the 40,000 patients who had taken LSD in a clinical setting and, for the most part, found it useful. The rooms were about to be legislated out of existence. By 1965, the rooms that nobody was watching were getting harder to keep open. Not because the results had stopped being good, because the results had stopped mattering. Something had shifted in the public understanding of what LSD was, and the shift had nothing to do with the science. Sanderson's clinic was still running. Osmond's work was still being cited. Researchers across Europe and North America had by this point published over 1,000 papers on LSD, its effects, its therapeutic applications, its mechanisms, its risks. More than 40,000 patients had received it in clinical settings. The body of evidence was, for a substance that had existed for 20 years, substantial. None of that was the story anymore. The story was Timothy Leary on television. The story was painted buses and all-night parties, and college students dropping out of universities to follow a Harvard professor who had decided that the point of consciousness was to dissolve it. The story was the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, where 1967's Summer of Love had produced a neighborhood that looked, from certain angles, like a psychiatric ward that had decided to have a better attitude about it. The researchers watched all of this with the specific horror of people who have spent 15 years building something careful, precise, and genuinely useful and who are now watching it be used to decorate a van. In March of 1966, Life magazine published a cover story. The headline was, "The Exploding Threat of the Mind Drug That Got Out of Hand." The article was long. It covered the counterculture, the acid tests, Leary's evangelical campaign, and the growing number of young Americans experimenting with LSD outside any medical context. It covered bad trips. It covered emergency room admissions. It quoted psychiatrists who were alarmed, and parents who were more alarmed, and politicians who were most alarmed of all. It did not, in any substantial way, cover the 40,000 patients who had taken LSD in clinical settings and found it useful. It did not cover Sanderson's clinic. It didn't go to Saskatchewan. It didn't quote Osmond on what his patients had actually reported. This was not a journalistic failure exactly. It was a framing decision. The frame had already been set. LSD was a threat, a crisis, an explosion. And frames, as Wrinkle's model psychosis had demonstrated 15 years earlier, determine what gets looked at and what gets left out. The article reached a readership of approximately 8 million people. It changed nothing about what LSD actually did in a controlled clinical setting. It changed everything about what LSD was understood to be. In 1967, a scientist named Maimon Cohen published a paper. The paper claimed that LSD damaged chromosomes. Specifically, that exposure to LSD caused breakage in white blood cells at a rate significantly higher than in unexposed subjects. The implication was clear and alarming. LSD might cause genetic damage. It might affect not just the people who took it, but their children. The word mutation appeared in subsequent coverage. The word birth defects appeared. Neither was precisely what the paper had claimed, but precision is not what headlines are for. The paper made the front pages. Every major newspaper ran the story. Congressional testimony cited it. Pediatricians were asked about it. The chromosome damage claim became, overnight, one of the primary scientific justifications for restricting LSD, a justification that had the singular advantage, from a political perspective, of being about children. There were problems with the paper that other researchers identified quickly. The doses Cohen used were far higher than any therapeutic or recreational exposure would involve. He had essentially bathed cells in LSD at concentrations that bore no relationship to what a human body would experience. He studied white blood cells in a laboratory dish rather than chromosomes in living humans. His sample sizes were small. His controls were inadequate. His methodology had gaps that were pointed out in letters to the same journals within months of publication. More importantly, no subsequent study was able to replicate the finding. Not one. The chromosome damage claim was tested repeatedly by different research groups in different countries using improved methodology and was repeatedly not found. A comprehensive review published in 1971 examined every available study on LSD and chromosomal damage and concluded there was no credible evidence that LSD, at doses humans actually encountered, caused chromosomal damage. By 1971, LSD had been illegal for 3 years. A bad paper at the right moment does not need to be correct. It needs to arrive when people are already afraid, to give the fear a scientific address, and to make the conclusion feel like it has been reached by evidence rather than anxiety. The chromosome paper did all three. The correction that followed, published in smaller print in more cautious language, in journals that reached fewer people, could not undo what the original had done to the public understanding. The researchers who had spent 15 years documenting what LSD actually did in controlled clinical settings watched the chromosome paper circulate and understood, with a clarity that was not pleasant, that they had lost a battle they had not been fighting. They had been doing science. Someone else had been doing politics. Politics in this case was faster. By the mid-1960s, a small group of researchers had quietly been documenting something that had nothing to do with the counterculture, nothing to do with Leary, nothing to do with any of the things making the headlines. They'd been studying what LSD did to people who were dying. The work came from several directions at once. Researchers in the United States, Canada, and Czechoslovakia had all noticed the same thing, more or less independently. Patients with terminal diagnoses, cancer primarily, who were given LSD in carefully prepared sessions showed, in a significant proportion of cases, a striking reduction in the fear of death. Not the fear of pain, not the fear of the process of dying, the fear of death itself, the existential dread that accompanies a terminal diagnosis, the one that colours every remaining day, the one that makes it impossible to be fully present for the time that remains, appeared in a meaningful number of cases to lift, sometimes significantly, sometimes dramatically. One session looked like this. A patient had been given 6 weeks. The doctor had said it carefully in the language doctors use when they're trying to be kind and precise at the same time. 6 weeks, possibly 8, depending on how things go. There was a family, things unsaid, a particular quality of light on Tuesday mornings that had never been noticed before and was now noticed constantly, because it had become apparent that it would not always be there to notice. The fear was not abstract, physical. It lived in the chest, in a specific place slightly to the left of where the ribs meet, present on waking and on trying to sleep, and in the space between any two thoughts during the day. Trying to examine it directly made it move. A researcher explained what would happen. A room, a couch, music, 8 to 12 hours. He would be there. The patient would not be alone. For the first hour, ordinary things became more themselves. The texture of the blanket had a specific weight and warmth that it had always had and that had never before been particularly noticed. The light in the room was the light in this room, not the general category of afternoon light, but this afternoon, these windows, this specific quality that would never be exactly this again. This was not sad. It was simply what it was. Then something began to change in how the fear was being held. Not that it went away. It didn't go away. But the relationship to it shifted, gradually, over the course of an hour or two, in a way that had no immediate language, as if the gripping had eased, as if the effort of holding on to something for a very long time had itself been a kind of suffering that had gone unnoticed until it stopped. The fear was still there, but it was no longer inside, it was beside, something to look at, the way you look at something you have been carrying that you've finally set down, real, with weight and texture and history, but not the person. The fear was something the person had, and things you have, rather than things you are, can be approached differently. Hours passed. The researcher was present. At some point, the thing that had been most feared, not the pain, not the process, not the specific mechanics of ending, but the fact of ending itself, became temporarily something that could be held without flinching. Not because it was no longer true, because it had become acceptable, real and acceptable, part of the same fabric as the blanket and the light and the particular Tuesday mornings. Everything ends. The ending is not separate from the thing that ends. The session closed. The researcher made tea. 6 weeks remained, possibly 8. The diagnosis had not changed, but something in how those weeks would be spent had. The researchers who documented this were not making philosophical arguments. They were measuring things: anxiety scales, self-reported well-being, observer assessments, family interviews about changes in the patient's demeanour, and engagement with remaining life. The numbers were significant. The effect was real and measurable, and, in the accounts of the patients themselves, often described as among the most important experiences of their lives. Stanislav Grof, a Czech psychiatrist working first in Prague and later in the United States, documented dozens of cases across years of clinical work. Patients with terminal diagnoses who had received LSD in guided therapeutic sessions described experiences that fell into recognizable patterns. A period of confronting the fear directly, often accompanied by intense emotion. A shift in the relationship to the fear rather than its elimination. And an afterglow period in the days and weeks following the session characterized by what patients consistently described as a changed relationship to the time they had left. Not optimism, exactly, not denial, something closer to presence, an ability to be in the remaining days without the fear consuming them. A Canadian research group working in Saskatchewan, Osmond's territory, though a different team, published similar findings, and Walter Pankey at the Spring Grove State Hospital in Maryland ran the most systematic trials. Patients with terminal cancer, carefully assessed before and after, showing statistically significant reductions in anxiety, depression, and what the scales measured as fear of death. The patients who had received LSD compared to controls who had received conventional care showed measurable differences in psychological well-being that persisted through the weeks and months of their remaining lives. Family members, interviewed separately, corroborated what the scales showed. They described patients who were more present, more able to have the conversations they needed to have, more able to be with their families in the time that remained rather than inside the fear of what was coming. It was, by any reasonable measure, a significant medical finding. It was also, by the standards of a generation of researchers who had spent 15 years working in a field that was being legislated out of existence, heartbreaking. They had found something remarkable at exactly the moment when finding something remarkable was no longer enough. The paper was published in 1967. LSD was made illegal in the United States in 1968. The research stopped. The mechanism of criminalization was not complicated. It was fast. Several American states moved to outlaw LSD in 1966 before the federal government acted. California was first in October. New York followed within months. The state-level bans were reactive, driven by the Life magazine coverage, the chromosome paper, the political pressure of an election year in which being seen as soft on a mind-altering drug used by young people was not an electoral position anyone was eager to defend. The federal Staggers-Dodd Bill of 1968 made possession of LSD a federal crime. The congressional debate was not characterized by extensive engagement with the clinical literature. Senators who had not read the Saskatchewan alcoholism papers, who had not been to Powys Hospital, who could not have named Stanislav Grof or Walter Pankey, spoke at length about the threat to American youth. They were not lying exactly. Young Americans were using LSD outside clinical settings. Some of them were having bad experiences. Some of those experiences were appearing in emergency rooms. The crisis was real, if considerably smaller than the rhetoric required it to be. But the legislation that resulted made no distinction between the acid test and the therapeutic couch. The same law that addressed Owsley Stanley's underground supply operation also addressed Sanderson's sessions in Worcestershire and Osmond's alcoholism work and Pankey's terminal cancer patients. The law does not make that distinction. The law classifies the molecule. 2 years later, the Controlled Substances Act placed LSD in Schedule 1, high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, not safe for use even under medical supervision. Schedule 1 was, and remains, the most restrictive classification in American drug law. A Schedule 1 substance requires a special DEA license to study. The application process is lengthy and demanding. Approval rates for psychedelic research applications in the 1970s and 1980s were, in practice, close to zero. The FDA added additional barriers. institutional review boards, understandably cautious about career-ending associations with controlled substance research, declined most proposals before they reached the regulatory stage. The circularity was total. You needed evidence of medical benefit to study the substance, and you couldn't gather evidence of medical benefit because you couldn't study the substance. This is not an oversight in the design of the scheduling system, it is a feature of it. Sandoz, which had been distributing LSD to researchers since 1947, formally withdrew its supply in 1966 under pressure it had not sought, 66 under pressure it had not sought, and could not resist. The glass vials stopped arriving in the post. The cover letter that had said with such extraordinary confidence that the psychiatrist may wish to take it personally, that letter was no longer being sent. The supply chain closed. The research licenses became unreachable. The clinical trials stopped. Sanderson's clinic at Powick Hospital quietly closed in the mid-1960s. Not dramatically. Not with an announcement or a public statement. The sessions simply stopped being scheduled. The 36 patients' files were boxed and archived. The couch was moved. The corner chair where Sanderson had sat, present but not intrusive, available but not directing, was presumably put somewhere else. The room became a different kind of room. The files went into storage. Nobody looked at them for 30 years. Osmond watched his word bury his work. Psychedelic. The word he had invented in a letter to Aldous Huxley in 1957, carefully chosen from the Greek to describe a clinical possibility rather than a cultural one, had by 1967 become the name for a movement, a generation, a set of aesthetics involving very specific fonts and colours and a philosophical posture toward authority and a rejection of everything that Osmond had actually been trying to do. He had invented the word to replace psychotomimetic. He had invented it because the existing name treated these substances as models of mental illness, and he believed they were something else. Tools for accessing the mind's own material, instruments for therapeutic work. The word was a clinical argument disguised as a noun. By 1967, his word described the Grateful Dead. It described the Haight-Ashbury. It described Timothy Leary, who had been fired from Harvard, and Ken Kesey, who was driving a bus, and Owsley Stanley, who was making millions of doses in a Berkeley laboratory. It described everything that was making it impossible for Osmond to do what he was trying to do, wearing the word he had invented for a purpose that had nothing to do with any of it. The irony was not lost on him. He wrote about it. He gave talks about the distinction between therapeutic use and recreational use, between guided clinical work and unsupervised cultural experimentation. He argued, carefully and persistently, that the backlash against the counterculture's use of these substances was destroying the evidence base for their clinical applications. He was correct. It made no difference. He kept writing. He kept making the case. He died in 2004 at 86 years old. His alcoholism work, the results that had seemed, in 1953 in Saskatchewan, like the beginning of something extraordinary, was by the time of his death largely unknown outside a small circle of researchers who were beginning, very cautiously, to look at it again. In 1973, Richard Helms ordered the records destroyed. The timing was deliberate. A Senate investigation was coming. The Church Committee, which would formally convene in 1975. Helms, who had been CIA director since 1966, and who understood better than anyone what was in those files, acted 2 years before the investigators arrived. Gottlieb drove to Langley and participated personally. The shredder ran. What was destroyed cannot be fully reconstructed. The 20,000 documents that survived, misfiled in a financial records building, missed by the purge, are enough to know the shape of what the program was. They are not enough to know everything that happened in every room, The rooms that were not documented or whose documentation no longer exists remain rooms. Gottlieb retired to rural Virginia. He tended his goats. He grew his Christmas trees. He made his yogurt. He was not charged with anything. He was not prosecuted. He gave one interview near the end of his life in which he denied that MKUltra had caused significant harm and described his work as a product of its time. He died in 1999. He had lived long enough to see the church committee hearings, the public revelations, the Frank Olsen story become a documentary, and the gradual reconstruction of what his program had done. He did not appear, by the available evidence, to have found this troubling. And so, in the 1970s, two kinds of erasure happened simultaneously. The government shredded its crimes. The scientific establishment filed away its breakthroughs. Neither was a conspiracy exactly. The second wasn't a conspiracy at all. It was just what happens when a Schedule I classification meets 15 years of careful clinical work. The work didn't disappear. It sat in journals, in archives, in the boxes from Sanderson's clinic, in Osmond's papers, in the Spring Grove Hospital records. It sat there in the specific way that true things sit when nobody is looking at them, patiently, without urgency, in no particular hurry to be rediscovered. The dying patients who might have found peace in a room like the one at Spring Grove were not helped by what Pankey had documented. They were helped by whatever was available, which in most cases meant conventional palliative care, anxiolytics, and the particular loneliness of dying afraid in a hospital bed, while the thing you most needed to find peace with was the one thing nobody could help you approach. The alcoholics who might have sat in a session with Osmond, who might have found the locked room and the key for it, were helped by 12-step programs and cognitive behavioral therapy and willpower, with the rates of success that those approaches produced. Not zero. Not enough. The people with treatment-resistant depression, who might have benefited from what the self-experimenting psychiatrists had discovered about the way LSD could temporarily restructure perception and make the stuck things unstuck. They were given the medications that existed, some of which worked for some people some of the time, and told to come back in 6 weeks. 30 years is a long time. A generation of people who needed something that existed, had been proven, and was unavailable, passed through those years. That is not a philosophical point. It is a medical one. The door had closed. The lights in the room were off. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in a Worcestershire archive, and in a journal that nobody was reading, and in the memories of a few dozen patients who had lain on couches in the 1950s and felt something finally move, the work was waiting. It had no particular opinion about how long it would have to wait. The filing cabinet in Worcestershire was still there. Sanderson's records, the session notes from his 36 patients, the careful documentation of what had happened in that clinic between 1952 and the mid-1960s were archived in a hospital that had become, over the intervening decades, a different kind of hospital. The notes were not lost. They were simply unread. There is a specific quality to information that exists and is not being accessed. It doesn't know it's waiting, but it waits. The journals were still there too. Over 1,000 papers, published across 2 decades by researchers on several continents, describing what LSD did in controlled clinical settings, available in medical libraries, indexed, retrievable, sitting in the specific silence of knowledge that the world has decided for the time being not to need. The gap lasted approximately 30 years. Between the criminalization in 1968 and the first cautious resumption of clinical research in the late 1990s, essentially no human research on LSD was conducted. Not because no one was interested, because the regulatory environment made it nearly impossible, and the political environment made it professionally dangerous, and the cultural environment made the combination of science and psychedelics seem, to most institutions, like a guaranteed way to damage both. Some researchers kept working at the edges. Stanislav Grof continued publishing theoretical frameworks, working from the clinical notes he'd accumulated before the door closed. Alexander Shulgin synthesized compounds in his backyard laboratory in California and documented their effects in books that were technically legal. Rick Doblin founded MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, in 1986, a non-profit whose mission was specifically to navigate the regulatory barriers to psychedelic research, which is a polite way of saying to push on a door that was designed not to open. The door was heavy. It took a long time. In 2000, a Swiss researcher named Franz Vollenweider published the first new controlled LSD study in decades, with human subjects in a proper clinical setting with full regulatory approval. It was a small study. The results were not surprising to anyone who had read the 1950s literature. They were surprising to most of the scientific community who had not read the 1950s literature, because the 1950s literature was in a filing cabinet in Worcestershire and in several thousand journal articles that the field had collectively agreed for 30 years to leave on the shelf. The results showed that LSD did what the earlier research had said it did. This was the first of many moments in the coming decade that would have a particular quality to them. The quality of rediscovering something that had been known and then unknown, of finding a photograph of someone you thought you'd never met and realizing you've seen the face before. In 2006, a team at Johns Hopkins University ran the first controlled psilocybin trial in decades in the United States. The methodology was careful, modern, everything the 1950s work occasionally wasn't. Informed consent that would satisfy contemporary ethics boards. Screening protocols to exclude individuals with contraindicated psychiatric histories. Trained guides. Controlled environments. Validated psychological assessment tools. The paperwork alone represented decades of accumulated institutional learning about how to study human subjects without causing harm. They gave healthy volunteers a single high dose of psilocybin. 2 months later, they assessed the results. 2/3 of the participants rated the experience among the 5 most meaningful of their entire lives. The same category as the birth of a child, the death of a parent, events that reorganize the architecture of a life. Not, it was interesting, or it was strange, or it was memorable. 5 most meaningful of their entire lives. The research team, led by Roland Griffiths, was not expecting this magnitude. The scientific literature had suggested significant effects. The scientific literature had not fully prepared them for participants who returned for follow-up assessments, visibly changed in ways that their questionnaires were struggling to capture. What the questionnaires captured, statistically, significant improvements in measures of well-being, life meaning, and positive mood. Sustained over months, larger effect sizes than most interventions in the literature. What the questionnaires didn't fully capture, participants sitting across from researchers at follow-up appointments and struggling to explain what had happened to them. The vocabulary for it was inadequate. Terms like meaningful and significant were accurate but insufficient. One participant described it as having had an experience that reorganized how they understood their place in things. Not a belief, not an idea, but a direct perception. Another said they had encountered something they could only describe as love, not directed at any particular person or thing, but as a quality of existence itself. Another simply said, something changed. I don't know how to be more specific than that. Griffiths later said in an interview that he had entered the study as a rigorous scientist with no particular investment in what the results would show. He finished it as a rigorous scientist with a rather different understanding of what he'd been studying, and with the specific discomfort of a man who has just confirmed, with modern methodology, something that Sanderson and Osmond had documented 50 years earlier, and that the field had been required to forget. The paper was published. It caused a quiet sensation in the research community. Quietly, because the research community had learned, over the preceding 40 years, not to make too much noise about psychedelics. But the paper was solid. The methodology was sound. The results were real, and they were the beginning of something that would accelerate over the following 15 years into the broadest and most serious scientific investigation of psychedelic substances since 1967. What followed was not a revolution exactly. Revolutions are fast. This was more like a tide, slow, patient, covering ground gradually and then more rapidly, until institutions that had spent decades treating psychedelic research as professional suicide were quietly approving pilot studies, and then larger trials, and then peer-reviewed publications that appeared in journals that 6 years earlier would not have touched the subject. The results kept coming in, and the results kept finding the same things. Alcoholism. A Johns Hopkins team published a trial in 2015 showing that psilocybin-assisted therapy produced significant reductions in alcohol use in patients who had been unable to achieve this through conventional treatment. The results looked, to anyone who had read Osmond's Saskatchewan papers from 1953, almost identical. The effect sizes were similar. The mechanism, something about the experience allowing the patient to approach what they had been running from, was the same. The paper's introduction cited it as a promising new avenue for research. Osmond had died 11 years earlier. His papers were in a university archive. Nobody cited them in the introduction. Depression. Imperial College London published trials showing that psilocybin produced significant improvements in treatment. Resistant depression. The patients for whom every available antidepressant had failed. The FDA granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy designation in 2018 and again in 2019 for different indications. In the regulatory system, breakthrough therapy designation is the bureaucratic equivalent of running a red light. It means the evidence is good enough that normal timelines don't apply. The FDA had not used this designation for a psychedelic substance before. Researchers published statements noting this historic moment. The 1950s researchers, had they been alive to read these statements, would have found the word historic doing some heavy lifting. Terminal illness anxiety. The Spring Grove results were replicated. A Johns Hopkins trial and a concurrent NYU trial both showed that a single psilocybin session produced sustained reductions in anxiety and depression in patients with life-threatening cancer diagnoses. The effect lasted months. Patients described it in the same language Punky's patients had used in 1967. Fear becoming something beside them rather than inside them. The thing held rather than the thing doing the holding. The researchers who published these results wrote, in some cases, as if they were making novel discoveries. They were not making novel discoveries. They were making the same discoveries that had been made before, confirming them with modern methodology and presenting them to a field that had been required to forget that the first discovery had happened. This is not a criticism of the modern researchers. They did not have access to the original work in any practical sense. It existed, but was not taught, not cited in the standard literature, not part of the living knowledge of the field. A discovery that gets buried is, for most practical purposes, the same as a discovery that didn't happen. The irony was structural, not personal. Nobody was being dishonest. The system had simply eaten the evidence and then been surprised later to encounter it again. By the early 2020s, something stranger was happening. LSD was still Schedule 1. Psilocybin was still Schedule 1. Nothing in the legal classification of these substances had changed, and yet the cultural conversation around them had shifted so dramatically that it was possible to discuss psychedelic therapy at a dinner party in most major cities without anyone excusing themselves from the table. Michael Pollan had written a best-selling book about taking psychedelics in his 50s. Business people in Silicon Valley were microdosing, taking sub-perceptual quantities of LSD every few days as a productivity and creativity tool, and discussing this practice openly in podcasts and magazine profiles. The word psychedelic appeared in the financial press in connection with clinical trial results and investment opportunities, the same word that Osmond had invented in a letter in 1957, the word that had described the Grateful Dead, the word that had been used to dismiss and criminalize an entire field of research, now appearing in the Wall Street Journal. The microdosing trend was scientifically a mixed picture. The anecdotal reports were enthusiastic. The controlled trial data was preliminary and inconsistent. Effects that showed up in self-reported measures didn't always survive blinded methodology. The placebo effect, when people believe strongly that a substance will improve their cognition and creativity, is not trivial. The honest scientific position on microdosing in 2023 was possibly beneficial, more research needed. But more research needed was, after 50 years in which essentially no research was possible, a significant improvement. The question had returned. The rooms were being rebuilt. In 2006, Albert Hoffman turned 100 years old. The LSD Symposium in Basel, organised to coincide with his centenary, brought together researchers from across the world who were, for the first time in decades, able to speak openly about the clinical potential of the substance he had accidentally created 63 years earlier. Over 2,000 people attended: neuroscientists, psychiatrists, pharmacologists, historians, a few philosophers. People who'd been doing this work quietly for decades, in the margins of the field, who found in Basel something that felt to those present like a reunion of survivors. Hoffman, at 100 years old, attended and spoke. He was a small, composed man. He moved slowly, as 100 years old requires, but he spoke with the clarity of someone who had spent a great deal of time thinking about exactly the things he was about to say. He had been through the discovery, the wonder, the misuse, the criminalization, the silence, and the beginning of the return, and he had not, at any point in this arc, changed his fundamental assessment of what he had made. He believed it was useful. He had always believed it was useful. The world had disagreed for a while. The world appeared to be reconsidering. He spoke about the early days, about Sandoz and the cover letter, and the glass vials going out in the post, about the psychiatrists who had taken it at their desks and found their resistant patients suddenly visible, about Sanderson and the couch, and what the patients had reported. He spoke about these things not as history, but as evidence, a record of what the molecule did when approached correctly, which the subsequent 60 years had neither disproved nor superseded. He was asked, at the symposium, what he made of the rediscovery. He said he was glad. He said he had expected it. He said the results had always been there, in the journals and the clinical notes, waiting for the world to be ready to look at them again. He said he was sorry it had taken so long. He'd been asked in advance of the symposium if he would like to take LSD once more, in a supervised setting, with researchers present. Not a significant dose, a gentle one, appropriate for a man of his age and the occasion. He said yes. 63 years after the bicycle, he closed his eyes one more time. Hoffman was 100 years old. The room was comfortable. Researchers were present, younger than him, which at 100 described everyone. And they were careful with him in the way that was professional and also kind. The dose was modest. He closed his eyes. What came was not dramatic. No demons in the faces of neighbours. No conviction of imminent death. No urgent need to be escorted home. The experience was, if anything, quieter than he remembered, as if something that had once been a force to be reckoned with had become, in his particular company, something gentler. something closer to the light in the garden the morning after than the terror of the bicycle. Colours were more themselves. The grain of things was visible in the way the grain of things is not usually visible. The precision of the world, the extraordinary, unnecessary precision of everything, was apparent again, the way it had been apparent on that April morning in 1943, when he had gone into the garden and found that the lens had been cleaned. He'd been sitting in this knowledge for 60 years. That something in this molecule, when encountered correctly, revealed something that is always present and rarely attended to. The extraordinary quality of the ordinary, the fact of things, underneath the category of things. This was still there. He opened his eyes. The researchers asked how he was. He was, he told them, quite well. 2 years later, he died. In April, at home in Switzerland, at the age of 102. He had outlived Sanderson and Osmond and Leary and Kesey and most of the century that had been shaped by what he accidentally made. He had outlived the criminalisation and the dark period and the first cautious years of the return. He had not quite outlived the problem child. Frank Olsen's son Eric was still alive, still looking for answers. The Powys Hospital building was still standing, converted to housing. The room where Sanderson had sat in his corner chair, now someone's living room or bedroom. The clock on the wall was gone. The couch was gone. The particular quality of quiet that had existed in that room for a decade of clinical sessions was gone. But the files were no longer in a filing cabinet. They were in a database, being cited by researchers at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College and NYU, who were building on what Sanderson had found without in most cases knowing his name. Hoffman had expressed in interviews in his later years one consistent regret. Not the discovery itself. He had made his peace with the discovery long ago, had decided long ago that the discovery was neither good nor bad, but simply a fact. A molecule that existed and that human beings would use in whatever ways human beings use things. The regret was the gap. The 30 years in which the work had sat waiting while people who might have been helped were not helped. He had called LSD his problem child. But problem children, he had noted more than once, sometimes grow up to do something useful. They just sometimes take longer to get there than anyone would have chosen. Longer, and at greater cost to the people who needed them in the meantime. In Australia in 2023, psilocybin-assisted therapy was formally approved for clinical use, the first country in the world to do so. The therapy protocol being implemented was strikingly similar to what Sanderson had been doing at Powys Hospital in 1952. Patient preparation, supervised session, integration work afterward. A trained guide in the room. The patient does the work. The guide stays present. Different paperwork, same couch. In Oregon, licensed psilocybin therapy centers had begun operating. In Canada, special access exemptions were allowing terminal patients to receive psilocybin in the specific clinical circumstances Pankey had documented in 1967. In clinics across Europe, researchers were running trials for conditions that the 1950s researchers had first identified as potentially treatable, and finding results those researchers would have recognized immediately. The arc, interrupted for 30 years, had resumed. LSD itself remained Schedule 1 in the United States. The legal status had not changed. Everything else had. The same molecule that a senator had described as a threat to American youth in 1966 was, in 2023, the subject of active clinical investigation at some of the most respected research institutions in the world. The conversation had shifted so completely that it was possible to forget it had ever been otherwise, to forget the filing cabinet in Worcestershire, the shredder in Langley, the chromosome paper that was wrong, the gap that didn't have to be as long as it was. Sanderson was still alive when the Renaissance began. He had been born in 1916. He had opened his clinic at Powys Hospital in 1952. He'd closed it in the mid-1960s and watched the work disappear, and continued, in the subsequent decades, to believe that it had been real and that it would eventually matter again. He was interviewed in the early 2000s by researchers who were beginning to look at the archived records, his session notes, his patient assessments, his careful documentation of what had happened in that quiet room in Worcestershire over a decade of clinical work. The files that had been boxed and stored in the 1960s were being opened. The notes were being read for the first time since he had written them. He was, by the accounts of the researchers who spoke with him, not surprised. He had always believed the work was sound. He had always believed the results were what they appeared to be. He had waited for decades, in the way that a person waits when they are certain about something that the world has temporarily decided not to agree with. Patiently, without particular urgency, with the deep stubbornness of someone who has the evidence on their side and knows that evidence, given enough time, tends to win. He died in 2010 at 93 years old. He had lived long enough to see the first clinical psilocybin trials in decades, long enough to read the papers coming out of Johns Hopkins that described, in the careful language of modern clinical research, essentially what he had described in his own careful language 50 years earlier. Long enough to know that what he had done in Worcestershire was not only still valid, but was being rebuilt, with proper funding and modern oversight and ethics boards that had not existed in 1952 in research centres on several continents. Long enough to know the work had waited in the right place, and that the waiting was over. Hoffman was gone by 2008, but the molecule was not. LSD itself remained exactly where the Controlled Substances Act had put it in 1970. Schedule 1. No accepted medical use. High potential for abuse. Not safe even under medical supervision. The classification had not changed in 5 decades and showed no particular signs of changing. The legal status of LSD in 2023 was identical to its legal status in 1973, which was the year the MKUltra records were shredded, which gives you some sense of how quickly the relevant institutions move when they are not being forced to. And yet, something had happened to the conversation around it that the scheduling system had no mechanism for addressing. The conversation had simply changed, not because anyone granted permission, because the evidence kept accumulating, and evidence, given enough time and enough replications across enough institutions with enough credibility, eventually becomes difficult to ignore even for people who would prefer to ignore it. The LSD trials happening in Switzerland in the early 2020s were running in the same country where Hoffman had synthesized it in 1943, at institutions a short distance from his laboratory, with equipment that would have been unrecognizable to him, a methodology that would have been entirely recognizable, informed consent, careful preparation, controlled setting, guide present, session documented, results measured. Full circle is a phrase that gets overused. This was actually a full circle. The Swiss trials were looking at LSD specifically, not psilocybin, which had become the more politically navigable entry point for the Renaissance, but the original molecule, the one from the bicycle, the one that had been in Sanderson's clinic and Osmond's hospital, and Gottlieb's Cointreau and Edgewood Arsenal, and George White's Telegraph Hill apartment, all at the same time in the 1950s, doing completely different things in completely different rooms. The results, when they came back, were consistent with what the 1950s had found, which is to say, the molecule had not changed. The molecule never changed. The molecule was the molecule. What changed, across 8 decades, was everything around it. The psychedelic renaissance, a phrase that had established itself in the scientific literature by the mid-2010s, and that Osmond, who had invented the word psychedelic, would have found both gratifying and deeply ironic, had produced, by 2023, a body of research that was impossible to dismiss on methodological grounds. This was important. The 1950s research had been dismissible, not because it was wrong, but because it had been conducted in an era before modern clinical trial standards, before randomized controlled trials were the default expectation, before statistical methodology had the tools it now had. A determined skeptic in 2000 could point at the Saskatchewan alcoholism papers and say, "Interesting, but the methodology doesn't meet current standards," which was true and which was a convenient truth. By 2023, the same skeptic couldn't say the same thing about the Johns Hopkins depression trials, or the NYU terminal cancer study, or the Imperial College London work. These had been conducted with modern methodology, pre-registered trials, blinded controls where possible, and published in journals that were not going to stake their reputations on weak science. The results were the same as the 1950s. The methodology was unimpeachable. The inconvenient finding had become, finally, a finding that was inconvenient to deny, rather than inconvenient to believe. What the results showed, across condition after condition, was something that the therapeutic researchers of the 1950s had been trying to articulate for 15 years before the door closed. That there was a class of experience, produced reliably under the right conditions by these substances, that appeared to function as a kind of reset. Not a cure, not a magic pill, a reset. A person who'd been stuck in depression, in addiction, in the particular paralysis that comes with staring at one's own death, could, in a single session with adequate preparation and support, become unstuck. Not always, not reliably for everyone, but at rates that dwarfed conventional alternatives for the population studied. The depression trials were the ones that attracted the most attention outside the research community, because treatment-resistant depression is one of psychiatry's most common and most intractable problems. The patients for whom antidepressants have been tried and failed, often multiple times, who have exhausted the available options and been told, in effect, that this is simply what their life is going to be like. The psilocybin trial showed response rates in this population that were startling. Not every patient responded. The ones who did describe something that sounded less like the relief of a symptom and more like the removal of something structural. A fixed pattern of thinking that had been running on automatic for years and had, during the session, become visible and therefore interruptible. The addiction results were perhaps the most directly continuous with the 1950s. Osmond's Saskatchewan work had showed something in the early 1950s that the field had been unable to follow up on. The modern trials confirmed it. The combination of a high-dose session with adequate preparation and integration support produced sobriety rates in alcohol-dependent patients that looked nothing like what conventional treatment typically produced. The patients who responded described the same thing Osmond's patients had described. Having been somewhere during the session that gave them a different relationship to the thing they had been running from, the mechanism was and remained imperfectly understood. The brain imaging data suggested disruption of the default mode network, the system responsible for the narrative self, the constant background process of being a person with a history and a future, and a set of fixed ideas about who you are. When that system went quiet, something else became possible. The fixed ideas became temporarily less fixed. What the patients reported was simpler than the neuroimaging. They said, "I could see it from outside. The thing I was inside I could suddenly see from outside." And that was different. Sanderson's patients in 1952 had said the same thing, in different words, in a different country, with the same molecule. The locked room, once seen from outside, was just a room. In 2023, Frank Olsen was still alive. He was in his late 70s. He had spent most of his adult life trying to establish what had happened to his father at the Hotel Statler in November 1953. trying to close the gap between the official verdict of suicide and the forensic anthropologist report from the 1994 exhumation that the skull contained evidence of blunt force trauma before the fall, a contusion above the left eye, damage inconsistent with a window exit, evidence that something had happened to Frank Olsen before he went through the glass. The CIA's position had not changed, the investigation had not been reopened. The records that might have told the full story had been shredded in 1973 by Sidney Gottlieb, who by that point was retired and tending his goats in Virginia, and who drove to Langley specifically to assist in the destruction. What remained, the 20,000 misfiled documents, the fragmentary record, was enough to know the shape of the program, but not enough to prove what had happened in one hotel room on one November night. Eric Olsen had read everything. He'd spoken to everyone who would speak to him. He had commissioned the forensic examination. He had made a documentary. He had met with CIA directors. He had accepted in the 1990s a settlement and a meeting with then-director William Colby and an apology, and then concluded that the apology had been offered precisely to close the inquiry rather than to answer it, and had kept inquiring. None of it produced a prosecution. None of it produced a formal reopening. The matter remained officially closed. There is something to be said for a person who continues to ask a question that the system has decided not to answer. It is not the same as getting an answer, but the question, kept alive, is itself a kind of accountability. The knowledge, sitting in the public record, that something happened in room 1018 of the Hotel Statler, that the people responsible were never held to account, and that somebody noticed and kept noticing and would not stop. The CIA had no comment. It rarely does, about things that happened in rooms it no longer admits were rooms. The 50 years between the criminalization of LSD and the current moment of cautious rehabilitation had not been a pause. They had been a cost, not abstract cost, specific cost. The specific people with the specific conditions who existed during those 50 years, for whom what Sanderson had found in Worcestershire and Osmond had found in Saskatchewan and Pankey had found in Maryland might have been useful, and was not available specifically because of decisions made by people who had weighed the political cost of association against the clinical benefit of the work, and decided the political cost was the one that mattered. Some of those people are still alive, some are in recovery programs with variable success rates, some are not. The filing cabinet at Powick Hospital spent 30 years closed, and what was in it was real, and the people it might have helped were real, and the gap between those two facts is not a philosophical problem, it is a medical one. 50 years of medicine's most intractable conditions, depression that didn't respond to medication, addiction that didn't respond to therapy, the terror of dying, treated without the tool that the evidence said was available, because the evidence had been buried under a political decision made in 1968. The researchers who resumed the work in the 2000s were sometimes asked what they thought about the gap. The honest one said something like, "It shouldn't have happened." The careful one said something like, "We're here now." The diplomatic one said something like, "We're building on a rich historical foundation." What they meant in each case was roughly the same thing. This is, it should be noted, not unique to LSD. The history of medicine is densely populated with treatments that were suppressed, delayed, or abandoned for reasons that had nothing to do with their efficacy, the history of psychiatry especially. But the LSD story has a particular clarity of irony, because the research was so extensive, the results so consistent, the suppression so deliberate, and the rediscovery so precisely a rerunning of the original experiments with the same findings. The molecule did not change between 1968 and 2006. The patients did not change. The conditions being treated did not change. What changed was the political environment, and then, eventually, the political environment changed again. There is a photograph that actually exists, taken in Basel on the 19th of April 2003, the 60th anniversary of Bicycle Day. Hoffman is 97 years old in the photograph. He's sitting at a table with researchers and historians who have gathered to mark the anniversary. He looks composed and slightly amused, in the way of very old people who have outlived most of the arguments about things they did decades ago and find the durability of the controversy somewhat entertaining. The researchers around him look, by comparison, like people who are very aware that they're sitting next to someone who synthesized LSD before any of them were born. He would live another 5 years. He would see more of the new research land. He would attend his own centenary symposium in 2006. 2,000 people, Basel, researchers from across the world gathering to mark the anniversary and cautiously celebrate the rediscovery. And he would speak, and he would take the molecule one more time in a supervised session, and he would describe the results as quite satisfactory. In the years between the photograph and his death, he gave interviews. He was asked repeatedly how he felt about what LSD had become. The Counterculture Association, the criminalization, the decades of buried research, the slow return. He was consistent in his answers. He had made something he believed was useful. He had watched it be misused, legislated against, buried and rediscovered. He was glad the rediscovery was happening. He was sorry about the gap. He had described LSD as his problem child. The phrase appeared in his memoir, published in 1980, and it captured something true about his relationship to what he had accidentally made. Genuine affection for the discovery, genuine anxiety about what the world had done with it, and a settled conviction, held across 6 decades of controversy, that the thing itself was not the problem. The rooms were the problem, the intentions, the politics. The specific human tendency to take something that works in one context and insist on using it in every other context until it becomes impossible to use it in any. Problem children, he had said more than once, sometimes grow up. He died in April of 2008 at 102. He had lived long enough to see the beginning of the answer to whether he was right. In April of 1943, a Swiss chemist pedalled home through Basel on a bicycle, convinced he was dying. He was not dying. The world was doing something worlds don't normally do. The streets were moving, the light was fractured, the face of his neighbour had become something his vocabulary couldn't name. And all of it, when it passed, left behind a morning in which the world looked newly created. The lens had been cleaned. The garden was astonishing in its ordinary precision. The milk tasted extraordinary. He had no idea what he'd made. He knew it was significant. He knew, with chemist's certainty, that something that produced this quality of experience at this scale of dose was not an ordinary compound. He did not know that it would heal people and damage people and be used to interrogate people and be given to soldiers without their knowledge and be dropped into drinks at parties in safe houses in San Francisco and be made illegal and be archived in filing cabinets and be rediscovered and be studied again and be approved in Australia and be the subject of clinical trials a short distance from his own laboratory 80 years after the bicycle. He just pedalled home. His assistant reported that he was riding normally. The world was newly created. It still is, apparently, when the conditions are right.